Hey guys, I'm back to read chapter 15 to you from The Clue in the Diary. This one is called Nancy is Accused, which is definitely not good. This is an outrage, Bess gasped. You mean we actually must go to police headquarters? I'm sorry I involved you girls in this, Joe Swenson murmured. He turned pleadingly to the officers. It wasn't their fault. They merely offered me a ride. They'll have to come to headquarters for questioning, the officer insisted. Mr. Swenson was escorted to the state police car. Before the troopers started off, they again cautioned George to drive ahead slowly. For 2 cents, I would step on the gas and try to get away, she fumed to her companions. I wouldn't advise it, Bess said uneasily. We're in enough trouble now. Oh, Bess, I was only kidding, George retorted. The three girls fell into gloomy silence. The prospect of unpleasant notoriety for their families was anything but reassuring. The friends were glad that at least they had been permitted to drive a short way ahead of the police car, for their entry into Mapleton attracted less attention than would otherwise have been the case. When they reached headquarters and parked, Nancy warned, Whatever happens, don't say anything that will incriminate Joe Swenson. Outside the building, the girls were confronted by the two men they had overheard talking in Stanford. This is our man, all right, one of them said as the trooper's car bearing Joe Swenson pulled up. The inventor was hustled out and into the custody of the men. Trying to help Swenson make a getaway, eh? The pair accused the girls. Come along, you three. Plainclothes detectives, Nancy murmured. As they went up the steps, George teased. What would Ned Nickerson think if he could see his Nancy now? If it comes to the worst, we can call on him, Nancy smiled. Before we're through, you may be glad he is my friend. Inside headquarters, the situation lost all suggestion of humor. Here, Nancy and her friends were told by Police Captain Johnson that the detectives had learned at the plant of Joe Swenson's departure in a car bearing Nancy's license number. He made no reference to the detective's source of information. To the girls' dismay, the inventor was booked on a charge of arson. Oh, so arson is when you set fire to something. So they're, pardon me, accusing Joe of burning down Mr. Rabold's house. No charge was placed against them, but the girls were asked a great many questions, and their names and addresses were written down. When Nancy gave her, significant looks were exchanged among the captain and the detectives, Dable and Rock. After that, the girls were treated less peremptorily. But if they had hoped that the name of Drew would release them at once, Nancy and the cousins were disappointed. They were informed that they must submit to further questioning. George and Bess were thoroughly frightened, and Joe Swenson became so agitated that he could not speak in a normal tone of voice. Nancy realized that he was in no condition to defend himself. The four were given chairs opposite the two stern-faced detectives and their captain. One could have heard a pin drop. The room became so quiet. The officer stared fixedly at Joe Swenson, who squirmed uncomfortably in his chair. Suddenly, Detective DeVille pointed an accusing finger, and his voice rasped out so sharply that Nancy jumped. Swenson, when did you first plot the death of Felix Raybould? When did I don't know what you mean, Mr. Swenson stammered. The keen glance of his questioner did not waver. You know well enough what I mean. It won't do you any good to try to lie. You were seen near the Raybould estate on the day of the fire. Who says I was there? Swenson demanded. You're accusing me because you can't find the real criminal. His shot went home, for the detective blinked, briefly nonplussed. But he went on. You were seen by the railroad station agent, and as soon as he identifies you, we'll have you behind bars. Now out with your story. It will go easier for you if you make a complete confession. There's nothing to confess, Swenson returned bitterly. I did go to the Raybould estate. Nancy's heart began to pound. Was the inventor going to confess something he had not told her? So, his questioner cried triumphantly, then you admit going to the house. I've admitted nothing damaging, Swenson retorted hotly. I went to the house because I had an appointment with Felix Raybould. Nancy was sure now that Swenson intended to make a clean breast of everything, and while admiring his honesty, she realized that he was apt to make his case appear worse than it might be. She longed to warn him to remain silent until he could consult a lawyer. Bess and George sat transfixed. So you had an appointment with Rabel, eh? Detective Rock took up the questioning. What kind of appointment? He had a patent of mine, and I wanted him to make a settlement. Rabel owed you money? Yes, he stole my invention. I wanted either the money or my drawings back. What did Rabel say? I never saw him. There were no lights in the house. He didn't answer the bell. Then there was an explosion, and I ran away. You knew he was in the house, and you didn't try to save him? The captain interjected. I don't believe he was in the house. When did you last see Rabel? In a restaurant here in town. I see, Detective DeVille observed with satisfaction. You had an argument, didn't you? Yes, Swenson admitted unwillingly. We did have hot words. It's not looking good for Joe Swenson. They're going to blame him even though we know he probably didn't do it. Which ended in a threat from you, the officer concluded. Joe Swenson shook his head vehemently. No, I swear it. I'll tell you everything, right from the very beginning. Rabel seemed uneasy, as though he were afraid I'd attempt physical violence. He had a guilty conscience, all right? You argued about the invention? Yes, he admitted he had deliberately stolen my ideas, but he defied me to prove anything. That made me angry. You threatened him? I told him I would take the matter to court. Of course, I didn't have any money to engage a lawyer, but my bluff frightened Rabel, and he told me to come to the house where we could talk privately. What do you think caused the fire? The captain asked. The explosion, which nearly knocked me off my feet. I was sort of dazed for several minutes. What happened next? It came over me that if I were found near the place, I might be accused of causing the fire. When I heard a car coming up the driveway, I decided to make a getaway. I scrambled through the hedge and ran to the woods. You're sure you didn't see Rabel inside on purpose? Detective Rock asked. 1,000 times no, Mr. Swenson cried out indignantly. I hated that man, I'll admit, but I didn't plot his death. Why didn't you tell your story right away? I was afraid it would be misinterpreted. I had no idea Rabel was missing until I read it in the newspaper. The three officials took turns questioning Swenson. They quizzed him about details and time, but were unable to confuse him. Nancy was certain that the inventor's account was true, yet she had to acknowledge that the story sounded somewhat implausible. The fact remained that Felix Rabel was missing, and that Joe Swenson was the last person to have an appointment with him. Nevertheless, the inventor's straightforward manner had impressed the officers, and Nancy thought they were on the verge of letting him go. Felix Rabel had been generally disliked, and it was common knowledge that he had made his fortune by ruthlessly adopting the ideas of various inventors. The three officials held a whispered conference, then began questioning Nancy and her friends. The girls told no more than was necessary, with Nancy stressing the story of the inventor's lost letters and the thieving mail clerk. She put in a good word for Mr. Swenson at every opportunity, and it was apparent that she was creating a favorable impression. The unpleasant session was drawing to a close with every prospect of vindication for Joe Swenson when there was a knock at the door. An officer entered, addressing himself to his superior. Mrs. Rabel is here now. Shall I send her in? As an affirmative answer was given, Nancy exchanged despairing glances with her friends. She sensed that since Mrs. Rabel had set the detectives on Joe Swenson's trail, the woman would create a scene. I'm sure she'll do all in her power to damage his case, Nancy thought. Her premonition was correct. Mrs. Rabel's very appearance aroused the sympathy of the officials. The woman evidently had worried herself into a state bordering on nervous collapse, and the sight of Joe Swenson made her distraught. Can you identify him? The police captain asked. Mrs. Rabel stopped sobbing long enough to take her first good look at the prisoner. Nancy, who was watching her closely, saw uncertainty flash over her face. The young detective was convinced the woman had never seen Mr. Swenson before in her life. Mrs. Rabel hesitated only an instant, then cried hysterically, Yes, I'm sure this is the man my husband went to meet. Felix feared him. He is a heartless criminal who deliberately burned my home and plotted my husband's death. She burst into tears again, and an officer led her from the room. However, the damage had been done. If the three officials had ever seriously considered freeing Swenson, the decision was instantly changed. The girls are free to go, the captain told Nancy and her friends. If we need you again, we'll summon you. What about Mr. Swenson? Nancy inquired hopefully. We'll have to lock him up. Sorry, if he's a friend of yours, his story may be on the level, but he'll have to prove it. There is nothing more to be said. Joe Swenson thanked Nancy for her interest in his case. You're the only real friend I have, he said unhappily. I've told them the truth and they won't believe me. If you only had a witness, Nancy murmured. Someone who saw you at the door. No one was around, Mr. Swenson returned gloomily. The place was deserted. Don't give up hope, Nancy said encouragingly. I'll find a lawyer for you, and I'll bring your wife and Honey to see you too. The conversation was abruptly cut short as an officer took the prisoner by the arm and led him away. When they entered the outside room, Nancy and her friends found Mrs. Raybolt slumped on a bench, sobbing. Nancy, provoked that the woman had testified unfairly against Joe Swenson, started to pass her without a word. Then pity surmounted indignation, and she paused. Don't grieve about your husband, Nancy pleaded. He'll be found alive. I feel confident of it. Mrs. Raybolt wiped her eyes and stood up. She glared at Nancy with an almost insane look in her eyes. You dare to tell me that? She cried out. You're an accomplice of Joe Swenson. My husband is gone. You probably helped plot his death. Mrs. Raybolt slapped Nancy's face. Whoa. Then began to shake the girl by her shoulders. Captain, she screamed, come here. I demand that you arrest this accomplice. Whoa. Mrs. Raybolt's out of line. Nancy was just trying to be nice. Wow. Oof. All right, guys. So we're going to have to see if Nancy does get arrested and what comes out of that. We have, I think, 5 chapters left in the book, so only 5 more days of us reading this book together. All right. I'll see you soon. Bye.